Deep in the humid forests of India and Southeast Asia, the Strychnos nux vomica tree dropped its hard orange-sized fruits. Inside each fruit nestled a cluster of disc-like seeds, each no larger than a coin. For generations, local healers collected these seeds, knowing their extraordinary power. They would dry them in the sun until they rattled in their shells, then grind them to a fine, pale powder between heavy stones. The resulting powder was intensely, unforgettably bitter. In small, carefully measured doses, village practitioners administered it as a traditional febrifuge, a desperate remedy for raging malarial fevers. But they understood its dual nature. That same powder, mixed with grain, became a devastatingly effective rodenticide. The creatures that consumed it did not die quietly. Their bodies would lock in violent, rigid spasms before stillness finally took them. This knowledge of the seed's potency, as both a potential cure and a certain killer, remained largely contained within regional practice for centuries. The bitter powder travelled in small clay pots along trade routes, its reputation preceding it. Yet the specific, crystalline poison within the seed, the agent behind both the fever relief and the lethal convulsions, remained a mystery of nature, waiting to be isolated and named. From the humid spice markets of the East, the bitter seeds travelled west. By the 1820s, European apothecaries had cracked their chemical secret. In cool, stone-lined laboratories, pharmacists used alcohol and acid to extract pure, needle-like crystals from the coarse powder. They labelled the new substance strychnine, a potent white powder now separated from its botanical origins and ready for the physician's shelf. Doctors, intrigued by its fierce potency, began prescribing minute amounts. They dissolved the crystals in brandy to create tinctures or pressed them into pills. A patient with a sluggish heart or weak digestion might receive a few drops. The effect was immediate and dramatic, a jolt of artificial vitality as the poison stimulated the entire central nervous system, tightening muscles and sharpening the senses in a dangerous borrowed energy. But the line between medicine and menace was perilously thin. Case notes from the period recorded the same symptoms in overdose: a sudden, agonizing stiffness of the jaw and neck, followed by violent, arching convulsions triggered by the slightest sound or touch, the very mechanism that provided a stimulant spark in microdoses could, with just a few grains more, lock the body into fatal, tetanic rigidity. As the 19th century drew to a close, those bitter white crystals migrated from the apothecary's shelf to the athlete's kit bag. On the cinder tracks and dusty country roads of Europe and America, a new breed of competitor emerged, the endurance athlete. They pushed their bodies to collapse in 6-day cycling marathons and brutal walking races that lasted for hundreds of miles. Exhaustion was the enemy, and trainers rummaged through medical literature for a chemical weapon to defeat it. They seized upon strychnine. The logic was brutally simple. If a microdose could jolt a failing heart or a sluggish digestion, perhaps it could also shock exhausted legs back to life. Coaches began handing out small pills before events, or carrying mixtures in their pockets. The athletes swallowed them, hoping for a surge of unnatural vitality, a sharpening of dulled senses against the grinding fatigue. They were gambling with a stimulant whose lethal dose was terrifyingly close to its therapeutic one. The practice spread through whispered advice and trial. A long-distance walker, muscles screaming over the final miles, would feel a dry pill placed on his tongue. A cyclist, vision blurring in a velodrome, would accept a sip of a bitter tonic. They reported a temporary electric clarity, a feeling of floating above the pain, but the line was invisible. the same substance that promised a second wind could, with just a few extra milligrams, lock their muscles into agonizing, suffocating rigidity. The experimental strychnine pills from European training grounds found their ultimate proving ground on a dirt road in Missouri. That August afternoon, the sun hammered down on the Olympic marathon course, a 24.85-mile stretch of choking dust. The only official water station stood miles away, while a procession of cars kicked up thick clouds that coated the runners' throats. Among the 32 men who started, British-born American marathoner Thomas Hicks began to falter under the brutal heat. His stride grew heavy, his vision blurred by the shimmering haze. His personal trainer, Charles Lucas, watched from a following car, his hand closed around a small glass bottle containing a milky mixture of strychnine sulfate and raw egg white. The theory was simple. A microdose of the alkaloid would jolt Hicks's central nervous system, overriding fatigue signals from his screaming muscles. In that moment, the line between a performance stimulant and a lethal convulsant was as thin as the dust hanging in the Missouri air, waiting to be crossed. The dust from the cars ahead hung thick in the air, coating Hicks's throat as he passed the 10-mile mark. His pace faltered, his legs growing heavy as lead. Coach Charles Lucas watched from the trailing automobile, his hand tightening around a small glass bottle. Inside, a milky mixture of strychnine sulfate and raw egg white sloshed, a desperate remedy for a fading runner. Lucas leapt from the car as it pulled alongside the staggering athlete. He uncorked the bottle and pressed it to Hicks's lips. The runner gagged on the bitter, chalky liquid, but swallowed. For a few minutes, nothing changed. Then a jolt seemed to travel through Hicks's spine. His back straightened, his eyes widened, and his stride quickened. The poison was hijacking his nervous system, overriding fatigue with artificial alertness. The effect was temporary and treacherous. Strychnine, in these microdoses, acted as a central nervous system stimulant by blocking inhibitory signals in the spinal cord. Every muscle fiber received a constant fire command. Hicks's heart hammered against his ribs, his breathing turned shallow and rapid. He was running now not on stamina, but on borrowed toxic energy that was already burning through his reserves. As the dust from the dirt road choked the air, Hicks's legs began to buckle. His trainer, Charles Lucas, saw the runner's eyes glaze over. With the finish line still miles away, Lucas made a desperate decision. He uncorked a second glass bottle, this time pouring a larger measure of the milky strychnine mixture. The dose was no longer a cautious stimulant. It was a calculated gamble against total collapse. Hicks swallowed the bitter liquid, chased by a sip of brandy that did little to mask the taste. Almost immediately, a violent rigidity seized his muscles. His back straightened like a rod, his jaw clamped shut, and his skin drained to a ghostly grey. Yet his feet kept moving, propelled now by the poison's frantic stimulation of his spinal cord, each step a mechanical act of defiance. His progress became a macabre spectacle, a stumbling, stiff-legged shuffle through the final miles. The strychnine was waging a civil war within him. Its stimulant properties forced his heart to race and his lungs to gasp, while its toxic nature threatened to lock his muscles into fatal, arching convulsions. Every ragged breath was a battle between the dose that pushed him forward and the poison that sought to tear him apart. Hicks lurched across the finish line, his arms draped over the shoulders of his trainers, Charles Lucas and another man. His eyes were glazed, his legs buckling with each step. The small crowd at Francis Field erupted, but the cheers sounded distant and muffled to the runner, whose mind was clouded by chemical delirium. He had won the gold medal, but his body was already betraying him, seized by the very substance meant to propel him to victory. They did not carry him to a podium. They rushed him straight into a makeshift medical tent, laying his convulsing body on a cot. His muscles began to contract violently, his back arching off the thin mattress in painful spasms. A doctor pressed a hand to Hicks's neck, feeling a racing, thready pulse. The strychnine, a stimulant in tiny doses, was now overwhelming his central nervous system, triggering uncontrollable muscular contractions that threatened to snap his tendons or stop his heart. For over an hour, the medical team worked. They tried to calm the convulsions, fearing the next spasm might fracture his spine or exhaust his diaphragm until he could no longer breathe. Sweat soaked the sheets beneath him. The toxic dose had pushed his metabolism into overdrive and then into revolt. In that tent, the dangerous gamble of using poison as a performance tool became horrifically clear, not as a strategy, but as a fight for survival mere minutes after an Olympic triumph. From the medical tent, the story spilled into the city's newsrooms. Reporters who had witnessed Hicks's agonizing finish now typed up their accounts for the morning editions. They described not a poisoning, but a triumph. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch called it a plucky victory, detailing how the runner had been revived with strychnine and brandy, as if listing his equipment alongside his shoes. The tone was one of admiration, not alarm. Editorials framed the chemical assistance as a daring athletic strategy, a testament to human ingenuity and willpower over the brutal course. In an era with no official rules against such substances, the line between medicine and doping blurred into invisibility. Strychnine was simply another tool in the trainer's kit, like a sponge or a massage. Across the country, other papers reprinted the sensational story. Readers learned of the strychnine marathon with fascination, not horror. The narrative cemented a dangerous idea that extreme measures were justified for victory. For the sporting world in 1904, the incident was a curious footnote, not a scandal. It would take decades and more bodies pushed to the brink for that perception to crack. Hicks survived, but the image of his ashen, convulsing body being carried from the finish line lingered. In the years that followed, similar scenes repeated themselves on tracks and roadsides. A French cyclist in the 1910s collapsed after a race, his muscles locked in agonizing spasms from a strychnine-laced reviver. The substance that had propelled Hicks to gold was now claiming victims in plain sight. The debate moved from locker rooms into medical journals and newspaper editorials. Doctors published case studies detailing the thin, terrifying line between stimulant and convulsant, while sports columnists argued over artificial aids versus sheer grit. In smoky committee rooms, officials from fledgling athletic federations began to ask a question once unthinkable. Should a competition won by chemistry still be considered sport? The crude glass bottles and raw egg white mixtures of 1904 started to look like relics from a more reckless age. By the 1920s, the mounting toll, athletes found dead in hotel rooms, others permanently damaged, forced a slow, reluctant consensus. The era of open experimentation was ending, pressured not by morality alone, but by a growing ledger of public poisonous failures. The debate that began with those public collapses finally reached the highest levels of international sport. In the 1960s, the International Olympic Committee convened, their meeting rooms a world away from the dusty roads of St. Louis. They drafted the first formal list of prohibited substances, creating a medical code that would define doping for generations of athletes to come. Strychnine was placed firmly on that inaugural banned list. The era of the officially sanctioned poison-doped Olympian was over. The small glass bottles of tonic and raw egg white mixtures vanished from trainers' kits, replaced by the new threat of disqualification and scandal for any athlete caught using such stimulants. And so strychnine, the Olympic booster, returned to its original grim purpose. It was reformulated into bitter-tasting blue or green pellets packed into small waxed cardboard boxes and placed on hardware store shelves. Its primary job was no longer to propel a runner forward, but to end, quietly, the life of a rat.